Hi, I'm Jim Ward of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode in our History Bite series. Today we will discuss the Scopes trial, also known as the Monkey Trial, which was the 1925 prosecution of science teacher John Scopes for teaching evolution in a Tennessee public school, which a recent bill had made illegal. It all began when the state of Tennessee passed a law called the Butler Act, making it a crime to teach evolution in public schools. A new organization called the American Civil Liberties Union responded immediately. The ACLU placed an ad inviting a teacher to help test the law in the courts. Dayton, Tennessee was in an economic slump, and the town's movers and shakers thought a sensational trial would put Dayton on the map. John Scopes was playing tennis when a group of businessmen called him to the town gathering place, Robinson's Drugstore. They asked if he would be willing to be indicted for teaching evolution. Though he couldn't remember actually teaching Darwin's theory, Scopes believed in evolution and agreed to the plan. It was announced to newspapers the next day that Scopes had been charged with violating the Butler Act, and the town wired the ACLU to procure its services. The Tennessee press roundly criticized the town, accusing it of staging a trial for publicity. Three-time presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan volunteered to present for the prosecution. The politician was already well known as an anti-evolution activist who almost single-handedly created the national controversy over the teaching of evolution and making his name inseparable from the issue. Clarence Darrow, a famous attorney who had recently acted for the defense in the notorious Leopold and Loeb murder trial, found out about the Scopes trial through journalist H.L. Mencken, who suggested Darrow should defend Scopes. Darrow declined since he was preparing to retire, but news of Bryan's involvement caused Darrow, who was a leading member of the ACLU, to change his mind. Darrow and Bryan already had a history of butting heads over evolution and the concept of taking the Bible literally, sparring in the press and public debates. The trial day started with crowds pouring into the courtroom 2 hours before it was scheduled to begin, filling up the room and causing onlookers to spill into the hallways. There was applause when Bryan entered the court, and further when he and Darrow shook hands. The trial began, somewhat ironically, with a lengthy prayer. The first day saw the grand jury being reconvened and repeating testimony from Scopes students who had appeared in that trial and jury selection. It was to a packed courthouse that arguments were began by the defense working to establish the scientific validity of evolution, while the prosecution focused on the Butler Act as an education standard for Tennessee citizens, citing precedents. Darrow responded by laying out the case in an aggressive way, part of a strategy related to the defense planning to waive their closing argument and preventing Bryan's own carefully prepared closing argument. The statement Darrow made is considered an example of his best passionate public speaking. Darrow's chief argument was that the Butler Act promoted one particular religious view and was therefore illegal. He spoke for over 2 hours. Witnesses followed, establishing that Scopes had taught evolution, and zoologist Maynard M. Metcalf gave expert testimony about the science of evolution, a signal that Scopes himself would not take the stand during the trial. Subsequent days saw prosecutors argue about the validity of using expert witnesses. This provided Bryan with the opportunity for an extended speech on the subject. Defense attorney Dudley Field Malone then countered with a speech of his own and received a thunderous standing ovation. The next day, the judge ruled that any experts on the stands could be cross-examined. That night, Darrow quietly prepared to call Bryan as an expert witness on the Bible. The trial's climax came on July 20th, when Darrow called on Bryan to testify as an expert witness for the prosecution on the Bible. Judge Ralston moved the trial to the courthouse lawn, citing the swell of spectators and stifling heat inside. Darrow's cross-examination challenged Bryan on various biblical stories and the validity and practicality of their literal interpretation. Bryan responded by claiming that Darrow's only aim was to cast slurs on the Bible. With Ralston limiting the trial to the single question of whether Scopes had taught evolution, which he admittedly had, Scopes was convicted and fined $100 on July 21st. On appeal, the state Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the 1925 law, but acquitted Scopes on the technicality that he had been fined excessively. Scopes was offered a new teaching contract, but chose to leave Dayton and study geology at the University of Chicago Graduate School. He eventually became a petroleum engineer in the oil industry. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all next time.